Today, we are going to talk about how much money I lost in my first year of flower farming. And I specifically named the video that way because I want to give people, especially those who are considering starting a cut flower farm, a realistic expectation of what to expect, especially if you plan on growing at the scale that I did. Now, for those of you who are new to my channel, I am entering into year 2 of flower farming. This was my first year. I grew flowers, sold them at a farmer's market. I grew flowers on a 40 by 90 foot plot. So not super big, but also not small either. And this was my first year. So this video will be applicable to you if you are looking to start a new flower farm. You're trying to figure out what kind of startup costs you're going to have, but it might also be applicable for you guys who have been in your second or third year flower farming, just to see, how you guys are doing relative to what my experience was. So buckle up, take out a notebook, because we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of numbers today. Now, there are 4 topics that I want to cover. The first is profitability calculation. So that is what I brought in terms of revenue, and then what I spent to get to that revenue, which is the cost piece of it. But this is less of a conversation around my revenue piece. I have other videos around how much money I made at my farmer's market, which was really the majority of my sales this year. But I want to focus a little bit more on the cost piece, because that is really what drove the equation this year. So we're going to talk about the breakdown of costs. I actually have them by category. We're then going to talk about how not all costs are created equal. And then we're going to talk about how I basically funded my business and how I manage my cash flow in my business. So let's get started. All right, before I actually get into the revenue and cost piece of it, I just want to preface by saying that it is very typical to run a loss in your first year. I believe that the typical saying is that it takes about 3 years for you to turn any sort of profit with flower farming. Now, that being said, you can have a small profit, you can have a large profit depending on the space that you're growing, right? If I decided not to clear my land, and if I decided to just stick to maybe a few planter boxes, some raised beds, I probably could have turned a profit this year, but it would not have been a significant profit. So the reason why people incur losses is because the costs that we are putting forward today, we're anticipating on getting a return that is greater than what we put in for that cost, right? So that's why you see people running losses, but there are smart and not smart losses, right? So that's what I want to get into. Now, let's talk about just fundamentals of profitability calculation. Profitability is literally revenue minus costs. So revenue is your sales, costs is what you spent to basically generate those sales. They could also just be overhead, so the cost of doing business, but it's a very simple equation. And to maximize your profit, you can either lower your costs, or you can up your revenue, or you can do a combination of both. So let's start with the revenue piece. Now, in 2022, I said that I predominantly made money at the farmer's market. So that was 45% of my sales. And I made $2,637 through the farmer's market. I did not have a ton of flowers to sell. So I would say that this is on the low end in terms of my potential, because I definitely could have sold more if I had more stems. I actually had to supplement buying flowers from a local grower to have enough to sell. And that did contribute to my costs, which I'll talk about later. So farmer's market, about 45% of my total sales. My Facebook marketplace, I have a video on how I basically sold over $1,000 worth of bouquets on Facebook marketplace over a 4-day long weekend period. When one of my markets got canceled, I made $1,585 from Facebook marketplace. And that is about 27% of all my sales. Next is wholesale. So wholesale just means that I sold to local flower farmers who were kind of in my situation where they wanted to sell to other customers. They didn't have enough stems. So this was a really, really small portion of the business. I only sold $157 worth, and that was, we'll call it roughly 3% of my sales. So there's two more other outlets that are a little bit more less traditional for that first year cut flower farmer, but I actually sold some bulbs and ranunculus corms through my online website because I wanted wholesale pricing, but I did not need the quantity that I received in order to buy in wholesale quantities. So I sold $811 worth of bulbs and corms, and that was about 14% of my sales. Now, I sold those bulbs and corms at above cost of what I got. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but essentially I was able to offset some of the costs that I have going into 2023 because I was able to do that. And last but not least, YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. I monetized midway through the year. I also have another video. I will be linking the videos in the description below if you are interested. But YouTube actually generated for 2022 $656 for me. So not terrible. And that was about 11% of my total revenue. So what does that bring my total revenue to? It brought it to $5,846.93. So just for simplicity's sake, we're going to call it $5,800 worth of revenue. Now, some people, they've already commented on my social media, and, you know, like I think sometimes photos make it appear that you're killing it more so than you really are. This is where I'm going to say, yes, I'm relatively happy and proud of the revenue that I generated, but the conversation has only just begun because now we need to talk about costs. So costs is often a part of the conversation that gets neglected in YouTube videos. And I don't think it's because people don't want to be transparent about it. I think it's because it's hard to keep track of. Even for someone like me who is trying to be on top of tracking, I use an app, I forward receipts to this app. I probably missed some stuff, right? You know, in the span of, or in preparing for this video, I was actually preparing it over 3 days, and every single night I would think about, oh, wait, did I actually submit that receipt and count that as a cost? And I didn't, right? So it's definitely one of those things where you should be on top of it because it really does add up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you the total number first and then break it down for you. So my total costs in 2022 were $13,753. Let that sink in. $13,753. That is more than double the revenue that I brought in. And if I'm to be completely honest with you, that is definitely a lot more than what I had projected. In fact, I had done a video last year talking about just anticipated costs and everything, and it was not $13,000. It wasn't even 5 digits. It was 4 digits. So it just goes to show you that even a person who is trying to mentally prepare and budget, you know, will naturally go over budget, right? So it's one of those things where I think it's really important for us to dive into. And I will say that, you know, not all of these costs are necessarily what we call you know, recognizable in the first year. They will be spread out over years in the future. But first, let's actually talk about what comprised of the highest pieces of my cost. So of that $13,753, about $5,144 was actually spent on bulbs and seeds. Yes. So that is a very, very high number. And it is one of the reasons why my costs ended up being a lot more than I expected, because I went bonkers on tulips. I find it really funny that I only grew 50 tulips last year. And that was really for my landscaping. And then all of a sudden, now I'm growing 7,000 tulips this season. I've actually already harvested a few hundred tulips through my winter forcing experiment. So a lot of that is kind of like an investment in learning and just an investment in being able to have income that is coming in the off season months where no one else is really growing flowers. So bulbs and seeds were by far the biggest part of the cost pie. The next biggest piece is actually things related to the flower field. And this includes everything from literally starting from scratch and creating the field. So we're talking about, us moving into a flat field. Luckily, it was all clear. It was just sod. So we rented a sod cutter machine for a day. We cleared that sod. We ended up putting up a deer fence. We had to bring in compost. It was leaf compost, actually. We brought in free wood chips, right? So all of that stuff contributes to the flower field. But I also counted things like, like hose, wheelbarrows, that kind of stuff, right? That all is a part of the flower field. And that was $3,920. So, not an insignificant amount of money, especially given the fact that it is only 40 by 90 feet. The third largest component of my costs was the costs related to basically run a farmer's market. So this totaled up to $1,924. This includes the fee for the farmer's market, insurance for the farmer's market, buying a canopy for the farmer's market. I had to buy some dumbbell weights to keep the tent down, right? So there are all of these like small costs that you may not anticipate, and they do add up. So that was $1,900 worth. And then I'm going to do one more, which is the bucket of education. Now, I really believe in investing in myself. So I took a workshop, and this was a workshop on how to force tulips in the winter. And this workshop was $1,200. So, right there, these are my big ticket items. They cross the $1,000 threshold. When you look at all the other categories, they're all in the hundreds, if not less, right? So really my next biggest bucket was the cost to run my website. I use Squarespace. I used their annual plan. And because I had an e-commerce piece of that website to sell the corms and the bulbs, that was a little bit extra. So that's a total of $285, right? So you guys get the point here. But when you look at just now plugging what I said for revenue and cost into the profitability equation, that gets me to a total profit of negative $7,906, right? So if you're going to round negative 7.9K, which is a big chunk of money to lose. Now, again, as I said earlier, this is with this is with the hope that the costs or the investments that I made in year one are going to give me some sort of return in the following years, right? And so obviously I'm not going to have to pay for a deer fence again in the future. I'm not going to have to clear the field again in the future, right? So that's where I want to start talking about how not all costs are created equal. But before I talk about that, one thing I want to mention is this doesn't even include my labor. This does not include the amount of time that we spent to clear the land. It doesn't include the amount of time it takes to grow the flowers, to harvest the flowers. I actually did keep track of all of the labor that was involved in terms of us running the farmer's market, right? So that really is just me manning the booth, as well as Eric helping me set up, come back home, pick me up again, and then the amount of labor to get the flowers ready. So I did include the labor to harvest, as well as put together bouquets. And that was really around $1,600 worth of labor for the farmer's market alone. If I were to include the costs for just setting up the field and getting it into a state that is ready to be planted and that kind of stuff, it's probably another solid $1,500 between Eric and myself, about 100 hours worth. We spent literally, I would say, weeks just trying to clear the land. It wasn't necessarily using the sod machine and rolling up the sod that was most time intensive. That actually only took us one day. It was getting rid of the sod. And one thing that I learned is have a plan for what you want to do with all that sod, because initially we're like, oh, we'll just patch up the bare spots and the other parts of the yard with that sod. 40 by 90 feet of sod is a lot of sod. And it is very heavy because we have clay soil. So eventually I had people come from Facebook Marketplace to pick up the sod and all that stuff. So anyway, it was an extraordinary amount of labor, right? And there's still obviously other labor involved in running a flower farm. So I just want to make sure that you guys are all clear that that $7,900 that I'm talking about in terms of loss doesn't even include the loss of labor here. So that brings me to the topic of how not all costs are created equal. In the world of accounting, there is something called PP&E, plant, property, and equipment. And these are things that we consider as hard assets. They are hard assets that you might pay upfront, you might pay over time, but the point is that they're there and they operate on your facility or land over an extended period of time, right? So the deer fence is a great example. It would be unfair to say that all of the costs that I bore in year one are only benefiting me in year one. No, because like I'm going to be using the deer fence for however long I grow flowers or if I garden, right? And the deer fence was one of those things where we knew it was absolutely necessary. I mean, when we didn't have the deer fence, it was not only a mental burden, but I would come out, the deer would be decimating my seedlings and all that stuff. Like I really would not have had much to sell. We were in a drought this year, so the deer were especially desperate. They were jumping over 6-foot fences. So I'm really glad I put in, I think it's an 8.5-foot tall fence, and we did not have any deer problems, right? But that deer fence cost me $2,000 or $2,045. And from a tax perspective, my accountant will help make sure that that cost is spread out over time over the next few years. The other thing for me in PP&E was what I called the infrastructure startup costs to create the field, right? And then any minor tools or farming materials. So that added up to about $1,874. Last but not least, another big ticket item here is for my winter forcing. We actually had to build what I affectionately called my mouse fortress. So we live relatively in it's not a rural area, but we have quite a bit of land. We have field mice, and that field mice does, they do get into the basement, they do get into the garage. I did not realize that we had, a bigger field mice problem until I had tulip bulbs rooting. So they were both in the garage. They're still in the garage. And I've had to have some workarounds that were more cost effective, we'll call it, through cardboard boxes. But in the basement, in order for me to grow, we needed to buy lumber and some wire mesh that was 1/4 inch to basically build a fortress to prevent the mice from going in. And between that and the hydroponic trays, as well as the grow lights, I spent about $366 for all of that, right? So indoor growing also has a startup cost associated with it. And so total for PP&E is about $4,285, right? So that is a good chunk of the $13,000 or so that I spent in total costs. The other category here, I said education, right? I said that I spent about $1,200 on the tulip workshop, but there are some other things that I pay for in the form of subscriptions that I also count towards the education category. One subscription, one that I really, really recommend if you're serious about flower farming, is a membership to the ASCFG, the American Association of Cut Flower Growers. And this is not necessarily a cheap subscription. It's over $200 a year, but it gives you access to other growers. They give you a a magazine on a quarterly basis. And there's just a lot of really good material out there that they publish. And then there's even a Facebook group, right? So I find that stuff really invaluable. It's something that I will renew. Another publication that I do like, I'm not sure if it's something that I'm gonna use long-term, but I am planning on still using my subscription in 2022, is Growing for Market. It is a magazine for growers, and it is growers of both flowers and vegetables. And I got a lot from it. In fact, I paid my subscription back basically almost immediately because I found an article talking about how you can buy specific insurance at a farm for selling at a farmer's market. And that insurance was significantly cheaper than me trying to buy just total farm insurance. So, I wasn't going to have any people come onto the farm really. So I didn't see it as a liability in that sense, and I'm not hiring any workers, right? So that I thought was just a really good investment, and I always really do enjoy the articles that they put out on a monthly basis. So that was the education piece. Total, that's $1,458 that I spend. And then I have two more categories to talk about. But the first of the two is the cost of my bulbs and my corms. Now, this falls into the category of not all costs are created equal, because these are costs that I need to incur this year, even though the return on that investment is not going to be recognized until next year. And I think this is the biggest thing about flower farming, is that you have to buy now seeds and corms and bulbs in order to be able to grow for the year after. And that is never going to change in the next year or the year after. If anything, it is now necessary to buy earlier rather than later, right? So that is the one biggest difference between this business that I'm running versus the soap business that I had before. So the total cost of my bulbs and corms came out to about $2,796. And that was primarily split between the tulips and the ranunculus. So tulip bulbs, I spent $2,328. That is after some refunds that I got, because I actually had a significant amount of bulbs that arrived pretty rotted. And luckily my supplier was pretty good about giving me a refund right away. For the corms, for the ranunculus, they cost me $467. So that's not cheap. But the reason why that total actually gets reduced down a bit is because I was able to sell some of that to other fellow flower farmers. So for tulips, I sold $394 worth of bulbs. And then for the ranunculus, I actually sold $520, which means that I've actually already made money on those ranunculus corms before I even have grown any ranunculus, right? And if you're interested in buying ranunculus corms, they are still on my website. I just put some more inventory up. I'm actually not going to be able to start as much ranunculus as I had hoped. I don't have enough space out in the field because I had to field plant a lot more tulips than I had expected. They are still a relatively good price. There are $40 for 50 corms, including shipping for, and it's only for US residents, right? So if you're looking for ranunculus corms and you can't find them elsewhere, you can go to my website, b.a.r.e.flowerfarm.com, and there'll be a link for you to purchase. But through the ability to sell to other flower farmers, that actually brought my cost of these bulbs and corms back down to $1,882. So it's not a bad amount of money to spend for 7,000 tulips, plus I would say I'm probably going to be growing about, maybe we'll call it 50 times 5. So 250, 300 ranunculus, right? So pretty decent deal. And last but not least, in a very similar category, I had paid my local grower to start seedlings for me for overwintering into the spring. I had a plan where I did not want to start any winter seeds for the spring or summer season. I'm going to keep it a little bit more simple and be able to focus on the tulips and the ranunculus for the spring season. And honestly speaking, back in August, July of this prior year, I was in no place to be able to start seeds, especially at the level that I bought. So I bought $474 worth of seedlings to overwinter. That was hundreds of plants. I mean, I'm going to have a ton of feverfew, Sweet William, foxglove, Canterbury bells, sea holly, snapdragon, lupine, you name it. I am covered for the spring, assuming they make it through this weather, which I fully anticipate the majority of them to do, right? So for me, that was a really good investment in 2022, but I will not recognize that investment result until 2023. So what does that mean? That really means that the majority of my costs were actually costs that are not going to be recognized till next year, right? So the 13,000 the 13,000-ish in terms of costs is not a true $13,000 in terms of cost. I think that some fundamentals around costs for people to consider, especially if you're early on in your flower farming journey, is one, just making sure that they are necessary, that you need to make that investment, especially if it's a big ticket item, right? You know, like spending $2,000 on a deer fence is not something to be taken lightly. And that was just the cost of the fence itself, because we put up the fence. If you're going to hire someone to put up a fence, it's a completely different ball game in terms of cost. And we did not want to go through trying like the fishnet wire or like whatever it is, all of the jerry rigging that people do that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Because my dad tried it, it didn't work. And to me, there was just too much of a risk for me to start all those seedlings and spend all that time and effort only to have a risk that the deer might still eat it, right? So make sure that you need to make the cost or make the payout first, and two, that it will have some sort of payoff later. So let's talk about some of the things that actually I was able to keep down in terms of costs for year one. So I would say that relative to most other people, especially those who are starting fresh from a field that they have never cultivated before, I spent less money on fertilizer and compost. And so for compost, I bought leaf compost in bulk. Leaf compost is not the most nutritious compost out there, but it is compost. And I bought that in bulk it was $40 per cubic foot. My husband and I actually picked that up because we have a pickup truck, we have a trailer. So we were also able to save on that. But even then, I mean, we picked up at least like 6 truckloads full of it, and we could have done more than that. So, you know, when you think about 6 cubic feet or cubic yards of compost at $40 each, that's, you know, $240. I think we might have actually even picked up more, because I think I remember that being over $300 worth. But anyway, so we tried to make sure that the compost that we got was relatively cost efficient, but also more importantly, low risk, because compost is something that is honestly hard to trust once you start buying it in bulk. You just don't know if there are weed seeds in there. You don't know if there's stuff in there that was decomposed from things that were sprayed, right? There's a lot of stories of people applying compost on their land, and it's just there's like hazardous stuff in there that ends up killing the seedlings. So that was also another reason why I went with leaf compost. I also compost our own kitchen scraps, and obviously that was not enough for us to supplement the field with, but I did collect used tea leaves from a local boba or milk tea shop nearby, and so I am creating compost there. What also really helps is that I have a neighbor down in the back who has something to the tune of, I think, 150 chickens. So he composts their poop and their bedding. He gets used grape skins from a local vineyard. He puts some other stuff in there like leaves, and then he has a tractor and all that equipment to be able to turn it. And he doesn't have a farm, so he can't use up all that compost. So he was more than happy to basically take buckets of it in his tractor and bring it to us. And that stuff is gold. I would gladly pay for that stuff. It looks awesome. It smells awesome, but he gives it to me for free. So I definitely benefit from that. The other thing is that because of my growing values, I actually don't try to do a lot of fertilizer. I believe in trying to invest in the soil health And so therefore the only thing I bought was a bottle of Neptune's Harvest for that seedling stage. And there were times where I might have fertilized here and there. It was more in my vegetable garden, but I really didn't fertilize my flowers this year. And not buying a lot of fertilizer definitely helps in terms of the cost. That is something just for you to consider, right? Like, it's just what I do here. I probably definitely sacrifice some yield in exchange for that, but I also really want to build my soil health, and fertilizer gets in the way of that. The other thing that I did not do was, because of my growing values, I did not use any weed barrier. I'm trying to use natural methods to suppress weeds, and any mulching that we did in the paths, we were able to contact local arborists or tree companies, and they delivered chips for free for us. So we did not spend any money on that. And then last but not least, on seeds, I might have spent a lot of money on bulbs and corms, but I did not spend as much money on seeds as the typical first-year flower farmer. I actually still bought way more seeds than I needed, and I did not buy any seeds for 2023. I still have some left over. I'm going to be focusing on sunflowers for the summer, and I definitely have enough seeds for that. So that's the other thing, seeds, even though you can use them year after year, the germination rate does go down. If you're just starting out, do not go overboard with overbuying seeds, especially if you have a limited space, right? Because you're just realistically not going to be able to grow all of them. All right, so that gets us to our last category, which is funding the business and managing cash flow. So my startup costs for flower farming were higher than I had initially wanted to. And they were higher because I didn't have any flowers to be able to sell to bring in revenue. So I counted up all of the transfers that I made to my my flower bank account, and I basically put in $5,300 for my personal savings account. I initially had only wanted to put $2,000 to $3,000, but that became completely unrealistic once the deer fence came into the equation. So my revenue, though, was only $5,846. So the question becomes, how did you pay for everything else? Since I only funded the account by $5,300. And the short answer is, many of you who have followed me know that I have or had this other side hustle. It's a soap and candle company. I am winding it down, but 2022, I was in year 9 of that company, and that company is now profitable enough where I can take that cash flow and basically fund a business. And so one would argue that I would never have even gotten into the farmer's market if I didn't have my soap and candle products. The people who ran the farmer's market really loved the packaging, the branding, the design, and even the mission behind the soaps and candles, which is how I got into the market. I did not get in because they wanted another flower vendor, but I really used those products to be able to fund the flower side of it, because I sold, it was about, $4,800 worth of soap and candles at my farmer's market. So if you recall, my flower sales at the farmer's markets were not very much. It was $2,600. So, I sold basically close to twice as much as of that in soap and candles. And all of the proceeds from that went back into the flower farm. And that being said, I was still needing to take some of the online profits that I made from the soap company, because it is primarily an e-commerce company. And I was able to then fill in any gaps in terms of cash flow requirements. And that was definitely a huge help in late third quarter, early fourth quarter, when the majority of my bulb invoices hit my credit card, right? So even though we place orders for bulbs and corms in like anywhere from April to May, June, they don't actually hit your credit card statement, or you're not asked to pay for them until the late fall when they ship out. So all of a sudden you have like a few $1,000s on your credit card bill, And, at that point, I still did not have enough cash coming in from my flower sales. So I did have to transfer some money from my soap business. So yeah, I mean, not everyone has a side hustle to be able to do that. I was very lucky in that regard, but I do want to talk about just this concept of managing cash flow and using credit cards. Now, credit cards may not be the best option for everyone. For me, it is a very good option. I use it in my personal and in my business life. And I can't tell you how many times that extra 30 days for you to pay off a credit card has saved my butt in terms of having or helping me manage that cash flow. So I use the Capital One Sparks business card. It's just a card that I found to work really well for my soap business. I get 1.5% back. That reward does add up over time, right? So make sure that if you're looking for a business credit card, that there is some kind of perk and rewards. But for me, the biggest advantage of a credit card is, one, this is with the understanding that you are paying off your monthly bill. You're not just paying the minimum, you are paying off the bill entirely. Because a credit card, if you are going to put debt on there, it is the worst rate that you can have. Credit card debt is just astronomical. Once you dig yourself that hole and it gets bigger, it's almost impossible to climb out of. So if you don't have enough cash and you need a loan, do not use your credit card, even though it's the easiest route to get a loan, right? Go to your bank, go to friends and family, find another alternative. So I'm using credit cards, paying them off at the end of every single month and really benefiting from, one, the rewards that they give back to you. Two, if you sign up for a new credit card, you actually qualify typically for cash back if you spend a certain amount. I believe right now on the Sparks business card, you can get $500 back if you spend $4,500 within the first few months, right? So that's kind of free money. But then the third, as I said, it's really the ability to manage my cash flow. So there are times where I know I'm going to have a big market and I wanted to buy something, let's just say I needed to buy a deer fence, right? $2,000. It got put on the credit card. I don't have $2,000 in my bank account yet, but I will have 2 markets before that credit card is due. And I know within those 2 markets, I should be able to make enough to then pay off my credit card, right? So that is what we call cash flow management. And I just find that at the small scale that I'm at right now, using credit cards is the easiest and most effective form of cash flow management for me. So last but not least, because I know I'm going to get questions about this. This is not a sponsored video at all. I was testing out expense apps and platforms for me to be able to track my receipts. So for my soap business, I use something called Expensify. I really liked it. It was $10 a month. The reason why I loved it was because I could either take a photo of the receipt or just forward the receipt to an email address. And that was a very easy email address for me to remember. It was receipts@expensify.com, and you set certain email accounts to be attached to your account. So it knows that once an email comes from one of those email accounts, it automatically allocates that expense to your account. I ended up trying something called Zoho for my flower farm, and I did that because it was free. It was cheaper per month. So Zoho, the one drawback is that you can do the same thing. You can forward receipts, send it to an email address, but the email address is a unique email address. It's a very funky email address. It's hello 31457. I'm never going to remember it. So every single time I forward it, I have to go find that email address, copy it, and then forward it, right? A very minor inconvenience in the grand scheme because it is free. It is free up to a certain amount of receipts. And so what it does is every single time you forward or take a photo of a receipt, it auto scans that receipt for you. That's the same thing that Expensify does, and then it uploads it into this platform. I actually like the Zoho platform a little bit better. It felt a little bit more manageable for me. And what I love about Zoho that I don't think Expensify has, unless if I just missed it, is the fact that it actually breaks down your expenses into categories. And this is why I was able to easily figure out, hey, how much money did I spend at my farmer's market? How much money did I spend on the flower field? How much money did I spend on bulbs and corms? So what you do is you set categories for where you want expenses to be allocated to, and then Zoho creates those categories for you. And then for every single receipt, you just say, what category is it? So I think I'm going to continue with Zoho. I might even try to use Zoho's accounting platform instead of using QuickBooks. QuickBooks basically went from $10 a month to $30 a month for my soap business over the span of 9 years. $30 per month in the grand scheme of my soap business is not a lot, but it is not something I want to be paying for flower farming. And I do feel like that the integration of the expense platform to have it with both Zoho Expense and Zoho Books would actually make that integration a little bit easier, because right now I have to pay to integrate Expensify into QuickBooks, and then I have to pay another fee to integrate my Shopify into QuickBooks, right? So I'm paying a lot of fees just to get these systems to talk together. Look, at my soap scale, it's worth it. It's, that business is a 5-figure profit generating business. So those fees are not a lot for that business, but I can't afford that for the flower business right now, right? So I'm always looking for these newer programs to try. So if you don't have a way of capturing your expenses right now, I would really suggest that you look into some sort of service app. They're usually free for a trial, right? Use that because it is so necessary for you to keep track of your costs. And these things just make it a lot easier, right? Literally every single time I walk out of Home Depot, if I'm swiping my b.a.r.e Flower Farm credit card, I am literally taking a photo of it and then sending it to that app so that way I remember it. It just, you don't want to get to a state where I used to be at the end of every single year in the beginning of the tax season. You're sitting there like, what did I spend money on, right? Like, do it over time and it makes life so much easier. All right, so hopefully this video was helpful for you. Hopefully it was not all doom and gloom for you either. The purpose of this video is really to give people a realistic expectation. I'll never forget the first day I started my full-time job. We actually were in the middle of performance reviews, and the head of the department was basically trying to set expectations. And he said something to the lines of, look, we have good jobs, we make decent money, but if you're looking to become wealthy from this job, you're in the wrong industry and you're at the wrong company. You will get merit increases each year to the tune of maybe 1% to 2%. Certain other jobs don't have any other increases, but you're not going to get 20 to 30% increases like you would say in finance, right? So I loved it because he completely just level set that expectation for me. And I think that the same thing goes for flower farming. Look, none of us go into flower farming intending to become bazillionaires. I mean, could you become the next Florette? Yes, possibly. But I think that realistically, we go into flower farming because we have a passion for either flower farming. We love it. We love being outside. This is a labor of love. If you're looking to get rich fast, I would encourage you to look at other places to do that, because this is a slow and steady business. You have to really enjoy it. You have to be able to wear different hats. And you honestly have to be able to be willing to put up with a lot of hard work, a lot of sweat, and just a lot of stuff that you may not have anticipated. So anyway, drop me some notes in the comments below. Let me know how you did in your first year, second, third year. And if you have any questions for me, I will see you next time.